You know, when you think about India's fight for freedom, your mind probably jumps straight to nonviolent protests, right? But what if I told you there was another side to the story? A parallel struggle, one fought with bombs, with bullets, and with this absolutely unshakable belief in armed resistance. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into that fiery, and let's be honest, often misunderstood chapter, the story of India's revolutionary freedom fighters.
And this quote, wow, it's from Bhagat Singh, probably one of the most iconic figures of the entire movement, and it just perfectly sets the stage. Revolution is an inalienable right of mankind. For these folks, this wasn't just about politics. No, it was way deeper. It was about the fundamental human right to throw off oppression using any means necessary. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the idea that caught fire. Then, the first sparks of action. We'll see how the ideology evolved from just nationalism to socialism. We'll meet some of the key faces of the revolution. And finally, we'll unpack the echo of their defiance and what it all means today.
All right, first up, an idea catches fire. So what was this idea, really? What pushed people to the point where they were willing to literally sacrifice their lives for it? Let's try to get inside their heads for a minute.
Okay, so the core concept here is something called revolutionary nationalism. This was a total rejection of the usual methods, petitioning, negotiating, all that. They saw that as getting nowhere. Their belief was incredibly simple and, well, direct. The British Empire only understands one language, the language of force, and they decided it was time to start speaking it fluently.
And their logic, you see, was built on a few core beliefs. First, they were like, look, we can't even begin to talk about social reform until we get our political freedom. That had to come first. Second, and this is key, they didn't celebrate violence, but they saw it as a necessary evil, a tool to get the job done. And third, you have to remember, they weren't making this up in a vacuum. They were looking at revolutionaries in Ireland, in Russia, all over Europe, and getting inspired.
So, why did this radical idea catch on? Well, it was basically a perfect storm. You had these incredibly repressive laws coming from the British, like the Rowlatt Act, which basically said they could lock you up without a trial. That caused so much outrage. Then add in decades of economic exploitation that was draining the country of its wealth. And finally, you had this whole new generation of young people who were just done. They were frustrated, they were assertive, and their patience had completely run out. The ground was practically begging for radical action.
Okay, so the idea is there, it's simmering. Now let's get to part two, the first sparks fly. This is where theory explodes into action and things get very, very real.
And the epicenter for all this early activity? It was Bengal. You had these incredible groups popping up, like the Anushilan Samiti. Think of it like a revolutionary gym. They were all about physical and moral training for the fight ahead. But then you get the Yugan group, which was a more militant offshoot. They took it a step further, arguing that political assassinations were a totally legitimate way to fight back.
In the level of personal sacrifice here, it's just staggering. I mean, take Khudiram Bose. He was one of the very first martyrs of the movement. And when he was executed, he was only 18 years old. Just let that sink in. 18! This wasn't a movement led by old, seasoned politicians. It was being fueled by the raw, unfiltered passion of kids, really.
And this fire, it wasn't just in Bengal, it was spreading. Over in Western India, especially in Maharashtra, you had V.D. Savarkar's secret society, Abhinav Bharat. They were doing the same thing, organizing, planning in secret. It just goes to show how these revolutionary cells were popping up all over the country, almost spontaneously.
Okay, now we're at a really crucial turning point in the story. The movement starts to evolve, to think bigger. It stopped being just about kicking the British out. The question became, what kind of India do we want to build in its place?
And you can see this evolution perfectly, just by looking at the name of one of the main organizations. At first, it was the Hindustan Republican Association, the HRA. Their goal? A federal republic of India. Pretty straightforward. But then, a few years later, they add one single, game-changing word: socialist. They become the HSRA. Suddenly, the goal isn't just political freedom anymore. It's a full-blown social and economic revolution thereafter. And the intellectual engine behind this shift was really thinkers like Bhagat Singh. I mean, his philosophy was incredibly sophisticated for the time. He was an atheist, a hardcore anti-imperialist, and a firm believer in class struggle. But what was really crucial is that he rejected what he called blind nationalism. He basically said, what's the point of just swapping out British rulers for rich Indian rulers if nothing changes for the average person? That was a radical thought.
So when we picture a revolutionary, we often have this image of a young guy with a pistol, right? But the reality was so much more diverse and honestly so much more interesting. This was a global struggle with all kinds of different people involved.
And we absolutely have to talk about the women. I mean, these were incredible figures who were central to the whole thing. You had people like Madame Phikiji Cama, who was basically an international ambassador for Indian independence. And then you had women like Pritalada Wadadar and Kalpana Dutt, who were on the front lines, literally leading armed attacks. Think about that. They weren't just fighting the British Empire. They were fighting the patriarchal rules of their own society at the same time. Just amazing.
And the battlefield wasn't just in India. This was a global fight. You had the Ghadar movement, based in the USA, made up of Indian immigrants who were planning this massive uprising back home during World War I. At the same time, over in Germany, the Berlin Committee was working to get weapons and support from Britain's enemies. It was like a high-stakes international chess game being played all over the world. So, with all this happening, both at home and abroad, what did it all amount to? What was the final score? Let's get into the legacy and the real impact of this movement.
Well, for one thing, the British took this threat very seriously. Their response was massive and systematic. They brought in harsh new laws, they built up these huge surveillance networks with spies and informants everywhere, and they staged these big public trials and executions. The goal was simple: to make an example out of them and scare everyone else into submission.
But we also have to be real about the movement's own limitations. Let's be honest. They never got the kind of widespread mass support that someone like Gandhi did. The different groups often didn't coordinate well with each other, and sometimes they just fought amongst themselves over ideology. And militarily, well, they were just no match for the full might of the British Empire.
And because of all that, historians are still debating their true impact. On one hand, you have historians like R.C. Majumdar, who say, look, they lacked a mass base, so their impact was pretty limited. Then on the other hand, you have people like Bipan Chandra, who argue that the real role wasn't military, it was inspirational. And of course, from the British point of view, they were just terrorists, plain and simple.
But maybe measuring them by military wins and losses is missing the point. Maybe their biggest contribution wasn't on the battlefield at all, but in the hearts and minds of the people. Through their sheer courage and their willingness to sacrifice everything, they kept the idea of complete freedom, uncompromising and absolute, alive. They sent a message that some people would accept nothing less.
Which brings us to one last big question for you to think about. Okay, so maybe they didn't win the war in a military sense, but by showing they were willing to die for their cause, did they actually succeed in winning the argument for complete and total freedom? It's a fascinating thing to consider.